King Solomon, a name that resonates through history, synonymous with wisdom, wealth, and divine favor. His reign was one of prosperity and peace, a kingdom so grand that the tales of it traveled far beyond the borders of Israel. Yet, despite all the glory, the riches, and the wisdom that Solomon was known for, there is a story not often told. A story of downfall, a story of betrayal, spiritual decay, and the tragic end of a king who once seemed untouchable. How did the wisest man to ever live end his life in such sorrow? Was it fate, or was it the choices Solomon made along the way? For centuries, people have marveled at Solomon's wealth, his golden throne, the grand temple he built, the alliances with distant kingdoms, and the vast network of trade and influence that made his reign one of the most prosperous in history. His wisdom was legendary. From ruling the kingdom with remarkable insight to providing answers to complex matters of law and morality, Solomon had it all. He was the man who asked God for wisdom, and in turn was granted wisdom beyond measure. His story should have been one of unending triumph. But Solomon's end was nothing like the image painted by his early reign. The man who could discern between right and wrong, the man who built a nation on God's principles, faltered in the very ways that he was supposed to be steadfast. Solomon, who had been so careful in his early years, allowed his heart to stray from the God who had granted him everything. It's often easy to overlook the subtlety of his decline. We see the riches, the grand architecture, and the peace that his reign brought, but we miss the cracks in his foundation. The cracks that grew wider as his heart began to change. As the king expanded his kingdom, he expanded his relationships, marrying women from foreign lands and creating alliances that were meant to strengthen his rule. Yet, these very alliances began to erode the core of his faith. He allowed foreign gods to infiltrate his life, and with each idol he built, he tore down the devotion that had once brought him close to the divine. Solomon had been warned. God had spoken to him directly, promising peace and prosperity as long as he remained faithful. Yet, Solomon's heart drifted, and with each step he took away from the path that had once led him to greatness, the kingdom began to unravel. The prosperity that once seemed endless now stood on fragile ground. The greatest tragedy of Solomon's story is not just his personal fall, but the lasting impact it had on his kingdom. A kingdom divided, a nation torn apart, and a people left to pick up the pieces of a broken legacy. Solomon's wisdom, once the guiding light of Israel, could not save him from the consequences of his choices. His failure to remain steadfast in his faith, his failure to protect the integrity of the kingdom he had built, led to its eventual division after his death. What was once unified under the reign of David and Solomon now became two separate nations, never to be fully reconciled. As we delve into the life of Solomon, it becomes clear that wisdom alone was not enough to protect him from his own desires, his own compromises, and the influences that pulled him away from the God who had blessed him. He had the wisdom to rule, but lacked the humility to stay true to the calling he had received. His downfall wasn't caused by an enemy army or an external threat. It was caused by his own heart turning away from the very foundation that had brought him to the throne in the first place. The story of Solomon is a sobering reminder that even the wisest among us are vulnerable to the temptations of this world. His life is a warning that power, wealth, and wisdom are not guarantees of lasting success. It is only through constant devotion and humility before God that one can truly endure. Solomon's end was not a sudden fall. It was a slow, gradual turning away from the truth that had once guided him. As we reflect on the life and death of Solomon, we are left with one important question. What does it mean to live wisely? To Solomon, wisdom meant more than just knowledge. It was a gift from God, a tool to help him rule and guide his people. But in the end, it was his choices, his failure to guard his heart and remain faithful, that led to his undoing. In the chapters of Solomon's life, we see the stark reality that even the greatest of men can fall, and when they do, the consequences can echo far beyond their own lives. Solomon's death wasn't just the end of a king, it was the end of an era, a loss that would be felt by the people of Israel for generations. The man who built a kingdom that was the envy of all nations left behind a broken legacy, a legacy shaped not only by his wisdom, but by his failure to remain true to the source of that wisdom. Today, as we look back at the life of Solomon, we don't just see a king, we see a man who, despite his unmatched wisdom, couldn't escape the consequences of his own choices. His story is a powerful lesson in humility, devotion, and the true meaning of wisdom. It's a reminder that no matter how great we may become, we must always remember the foundation upon which we stand, or we risk losing everything we've built. Solomon, son of David, ascended to the throne of Israel at a time of both remarkable opportunity and looming challenges. He inherited a kingdom that had been united under his father David and had been built on the foundation of military victories, strategic alliances, and a deep devotion to God. David's reign had set the stage for a golden age, and now Solomon was tasked with continuing that legacy and expanding it even further. From the moment he took the throne, it was clear that Solomon was a man of extraordinary intelligence. He didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited the wisdom of his father's experiences, the military victories, the vast network of alliances, and a legacy of faith. Solomon was a thinker, a scholar, a ruler with the remarkable ability to see things from every angle. His reign was defined by decisions that were not only strategic, but marked by a deep understanding of governance, diplomacy, and wisdom. One of Solomon's earliest and most profound accomplishments was the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. This was no ordinary building. It was the spiritual heart of Israel, a place where the people could come to worship, a place where God's presence would be felt. Solomon's decision to build the temple was symbolic of his reign. It showed his devotion to God, his desire to solidify his rule, and his ambition to create something that would stand as a monument to his wisdom and the greatness of his kingdom. The temple became the center of Israel's spiritual and cultural identity, and it was seen as a reflection of Solomon's wisdom and favor with God. But building the temple was only one piece of Solomon's vision. His ambitions stretched far beyond Jerusalem. Solomon understood that to truly secure his kingdom's future, he needed to expand his empire and strengthen his position through alliances. He didn't just rely on military strength or force. He was a master diplomat, using marriages to form alliances with neighboring kingdoms. Solomon took wives from all corners of the ancient world, and each marriage was a carefully crafted political maneuver designed to solidify his reign. Many of Solomon's marriages were not born out of love, but out of political necessity. His first and most famous marriage was to the daughter of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. This union not only cemented his alliance with one of the most powerful nations of the time, but also brought peace between Israel and Egypt, which had once been enemies. Solomon's ability to form these alliances through marriage meant that he could secure the borders of Israel and maintain peace with his neighboring nations. These marriages were strategic, a means to an end. But they also played a significant role in the expansion of Solomon's empire. Yet, these marriages were not without consequence. While they provided Solomon with stability, wealth, and influence, they also began to introduce foreign influences into his kingdom, an influence that would later come to challenge the very foundation of his reign. With each new wife came new customs, new gods, and new ideas. Solomon, who had once been a devout follower of the one true God, began to be influenced by the beliefs of his foreign wives. This was the beginning of the subtle erosion of the wisdom that had once guided him. In the early years of Solomon's reign, his alliances and marriages appeared to be a stroke of genius. His empire expanded, and Israel enjoyed a period of peace and prosperity. He forged strong trade routes, accumulated wealth, and strengthened his military power without needing to resort to the bloodshed of constant warfare. Solomon's reign became known as a time of wisdom, peace, and success. His court was a place of culture, knowledge, and learning, and the nations around him admired his ability to rule. But beneath this surface of success, there were cracks starting to form. The political alliances Solomon made, while brilliant in their own right, began to come with unforeseen consequences. His foreign wives, who were meant to secure peace, slowly became a source of tension, leading him to make compromises in areas where he should have remained steadfast. These marriages, once the key to his success, would eventually become the key to his downfall. Solomon's early victories, his intelligence, and his political savvy were indisputable. He was a king who built and expanded his kingdom like no other. But what many fail to acknowledge is the weight of the decisions he made during these early years. The very alliances that brought him strength also began to set the stage for his eventual decline. As Solomon grew in power, so too did the influences that would ultimately challenge his wisdom. He had the ability to shape the future of Israel, but the choices he made, rooted in political necessity and desire for peace, were ones that would come back to haunt him. Solomon's wisdom was the stuff of legend. It was said that there was no one as wise as he. His ability to discern matters of law, to solve the most difficult of disputes, and to craft solutions that were both fair and just made him a ruler like no other. Kings and queens from distant lands sought his counsel, and people from all walks of life turned to him for judgment. His wisdom was not just a tool for governance. It was the very foundation of his reign. From the moment Solomon assumed the throne, he was recognized not just as a king, but as a man chosen by God. His wisdom was God-given, a divine gift that surpassed all understanding. He was the man who could answer the hardest of questions, solve the most difficult of problems, and bring peace to a kingdom torn by uncertainty. His wisdom was so great that when two women came before him, each claiming to be the mother of the same child, he instantly saw the truth. And with a single act of judgment, he brought justice to both women. This was the kind of wisdom that defined Solomon: clear, decisive, and just. But with great wisdom came great responsibility. And this is where Solomon's story begins to take a more complex turn. While his wisdom allowed him to solve disputes and build a prosperous kingdom, it also gave him the power to make decisions that would have lasting consequences for the people he ruled. His ability to govern was unmatched, but as his power grew, so did his reliance on his own judgment, and this, in turn, led him to make decisions that would cause division. In the early years of his reign, Solomon made several decisions that were seen as necessary to maintain the stability of his empire. He heavily taxed the people, demanding resources and labor for the grand projects that he undertook, such as the building of the temple and the expansion of his palace. These projects, which were meant to solidify his legacy, were funded at the expense of the people. Solomon, in his pursuit of greatness, placed a heavy burden on his subjects, who were already struggling to maintain their livelihoods. The wealth that Solomon amassed was not shared equally, and the people began to feel the weight of his decisions. The taxation was not just a financial burden, it was a spiritual one as well. The Israelites, who had once been a people united under God's law, began to feel alienated from their king. The taxes went beyond what the people could bear, and the forced labor that Solomon imposed to complete his projects only added to the growing sense of resentment. Solomon's wisdom, which had once been a source of unity, now became a tool for oppression. The people who had once sung Solomon's praises began to question the fairness of his rule. Solomon's wealth continued to grow, but so did the discontent among his people. The very wisdom that had brought him to power began to create fractures in the foundation of his kingdom. His judgments, while brilliant in their own right, began to reflect a growing disconnect between the ruler and the ruled. He had the ability to solve problems, but he was now solving them at the cost of his own people's well-being. The moral compromises that Solomon made in his later years also contributed to this division. He had married many foreign women, and as a result he allowed the worship of foreign gods within his kingdom. What began as a diplomatic strategy for peace soon turned into a spiritual crisis. Solomon's wisdom, which had once been rooted in a deep devotion to God, now began to waver. His disregard for the spiritual foundation that had made Israel great, the foundation that had been laid by his father David, began to erode. Solomon's kingdom was now in a delicate balance. His intelligence had brought him immeasurable success, but it also blinded him to the needs and concerns of his people. The wisdom that had made him famous now became a double-edged sword. His decisions, though wise in their own right, were no longer seen as just. The very kingdom that he had worked so hard to build was now beginning to unravel under the weight of his choices. In his later years, Solomon must have realized that wisdom alone wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to be wise in judgment if the decisions made were hurting the people. It wasn't enough to be known for his wisdom if his heart was divided between devotion to God and the temptations of the world. The kingdom that Solomon had built was slowly beginning to fracture, and the people who had once admired him were now questioning the very foundation upon which his reign was built. Solomon's wisdom was truly unparalleled, but his decisions, his taxing of the people, his reliance on forced labor, and his spiritual compromises created a tension that was impossible to ignore. The wisdom that had once brought him glory was now the very thing that was causing his kingdom to fall apart. The cracks that had formed early on were now widening, and Solomon's once stable reign was starting to show signs of collapse. Solomon's marriages were legendary, but not for the reasons many might expect. While most would assume that his hundreds of wives were the result of romantic love or simple political necessity, there was a much deeper and far more consequential reason behind them. Solomon, the wise king, married women from many different nations, forming alliances that were meant to strengthen his kingdom and ensure peace with his neighbors. These marriages, however, would soon prove to be the very thing that led to his downfall. Solomon's wisdom, which had once been the foundation of his reign, was now clouded by his relationships. His marriages to foreign women were strategic, but they also brought with them a series of complications that would gradually unravel the strength of Israel. Each marriage was not simply a union of two individuals. It was a political maneuver, a pact that solidified Solomon's dominance and expanded his influence across the region. From the daughter of Pharaoh in Egypt to women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Sidon, Solomon's marriages were meant to secure peace and prosperity for his kingdom. They were alliances that were supposed to protect his people, to ensure that Israel would never be vulnerable to foreign threats. Yet Solomon's alliances through marriage did not come without a cost. These foreign wives brought with them not only their customs and cultures, but also their gods. The religion of Israel, which had once been built on the worship of the one true God, began to falter in the presence of these foreign deities. As Solomon's wives influenced him, his own commitment to God began to weaken. What had started as political alliances soon turned into something much more dangerous, a slow erosion of the values that had once defined Israel. At first, Solomon may have believed that these marriages were harmless. After all, they were part of his strategy to keep peace and strengthen his rule. But over time, these relationships began to take their toll on his heart and mind. His foreign wives, many of whom practiced idol worship, persuaded him to build temples for their gods. Solomon, the man who had once been so devoted to the worship of the Lord, began to indulge in the very practices he had once condemned. He built altars to foreign gods and even participated in the worship of idols. This turn to idolatry was not an overnight shift, it was a gradual process that unfolded over time. Solomon's wisdom, once a beacon of righteousness, was now clouded by his desire to maintain peace and political power. The very act of marrying foreign women, meant to bring unity and security, was instead sowing seeds of division and spiritual decay. Solomon's marriages had led him to stray from the path that had made Israel great. The man who had been known for his deep reverence for God, who had built the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, now found himself turning away from the very faith that had brought him to the throne. These marriages did not only lead Solomon into idolatry, they also undermined the unity of the kingdom. The people of Israel, who had once been a nation united under God, began to see their king as a figure who no longer upheld the values of their faith. Solomon's spiritual compromises reflected in his decisions, and the people began to lose their trust in him. The wisdom that had once been his strength was now being overshadowed by the very influence he had sought to control. He had become a man whose actions no longer reflected the principles he had once stood for. Solomon's marriages to foreign women were not just about love, nor were they purely political. They were about power. But in the pursuit of power, Solomon began to lose sight of the spiritual foundation that had made Israel strong. His marriages, which were intended to secure his kingdom, ultimately led to its weakening. The erosion of Israel's values was the result of these unions. And the very alliances that Solomon had built through his marriages began to tear at the fabric of his kingdom. The toll of these marriages on Solomon was not just political, it was spiritual. His once strong relationship with God, the foundation of his wisdom and success, was now in jeopardy. As Solomon indulged in the worship of idols, he grew further and further away from the divine wisdom that had once guided him. His heart, which had once been fully devoted to God, became divided, and this division created the conditions for the downfall of both Solomon and his kingdom. Solomon's story is a powerful reminder of how easy it can be to let our desires for power, security, and peace lead us astray. Solomon's marriages, which seemed to be the perfect solution to his kingdom's needs, ended up becoming the very source of his undoing. In the end, his alliances, meant to bring stability, became the very thing that caused his spiritual collapse. Solomon's wisdom, which had been unparalleled, was no match for the influence of the very marriages he had forged. The man who had once been known for his unshakable devotion to God had now become a king whose heart was divided, and in that division lay the seeds of his downfall. Solomon, once the embodiment of wisdom and divine favor, began his descent down a path that would ultimately lead to his downfall. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift, a gradual turn away from the very foundation that had made his reign so successful. What began as political compromises, driven by the need to secure alliances and peace, soon became personal corruption. The king, who had been known for his unwavering devotion to God, now found himself torn between loyalty to his faith and the temptation of power through his marriages. At the heart of Solomon's downfall lay the influence of his foreign wives who worshipped idols. These marriages, once seen as necessary for the political and economic stability of his kingdom, began to slowly pull Solomon away from the very God who had placed him on the throne. The wisdom that Solomon had once been known for was now clouded by the pressures of diplomacy, power, and compromise. Solomon, who had known God's will so clearly in his early reign, began to lose sight of it as he became increasingly influenced by the customs, beliefs, and gods of his wives. It wasn't a sudden break from God. It wasn't an immediate rejection of the faith that had sustained Israel. No, it was a gradual compromise. At first, Solomon may have thought that allowing his wives to worship their gods in their own private spaces would not cause any harm. But these small concessions grew over time. One altar became 2, then 3. Temples were built for gods that were foreign to Israel, gods that had no place in the kingdom Solomon's father, David, had established. Solomon, once the man who built the glorious temple for the Lord, was now building altars to idols in the very heart of Israel. It is said that Solomon's heart was divided, and that division became apparent in the very actions he took. What had once been a kingdom built on devotion to God, the God of Israel, the one true God, now began to teeter. The strong foundation of faith that had kept Israel united and prosperous was eroded by Solomon's own choices. His wisdom, once a guiding light for the people, became a tool of compromise, a way to justify his actions and convince himself that what he was doing was acceptable. But deep down, Solomon must have known that he was walking away from the path that had once led him to greatness. Solomon didn't just allow idolatry to exist, he actively participated in it. He didn't just tolerate the worship of foreign gods, he built the places where they would be worshipped. He erected altars to the gods of the Sidonians, the Moabites, and the Ammonites. He built high places for the worship of Chemosh, the god of Moab, and for Molech, a deity who required the horrific practice of child sacrifice. Solomon, who had once known the peace of God's presence in the temple he had built, now allowed that peace to be replaced by the sounds of idolatrous worship. And it wasn't just a matter of foreign gods being worshipped in isolated corners of his kingdom. These altars and temples were built in the very land that God had promised to Israel. They were constructed in Jerusalem, the city that had been set apart for God's glory. It was as if Solomon, in his quest to maintain political peace and power, was willing to sacrifice the very soul of his kingdom. The kingdom that had once been a shining example of devotion to God now stood as a fractured nation, torn between the worship of the true God and the allure of idols. God, who had once appeared to Solomon in a dream and granted him wisdom beyond measure, was now angered by the king's actions. God had warned Solomon, telling him that if he turned away from the path of righteousness and allowed idolatry to flourish in Israel, his kingdom would not endure. God had given Solomon everything: a prosperous reign, wealth, wisdom, and peace. But in return, Solomon had allowed his heart to stray. And in doing so, he had provoked God to anger. The Bible records that God became angry with Solomon for allowing these foreign gods to take root in Israel. In 1 Kings 11 verse 9-13, we read that God told Solomon, "Because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my decrees, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." The warnings had been clear. Solomon had known the consequences of turning away from God, and yet he persisted in his actions, thinking that his wisdom and political acumen would shield him from the fallout. But it was too late. The act of building these altars to foreign gods was the point of no return. Solomon's heart, once fully devoted to the Lord, had now become divided. The foundation of his kingdom, built on the principles of faith and devotion to the one true God, had been shaken. And with that shaking came the beginning of the kingdom's decline. What Solomon had once built through wisdom and favor was now being dismantled piece by his own decisions. The consequences were not immediate, but they were inevitable. The kingdom, which had once been unified and strong, would soon be torn apart. Solomon's reign, which had been marked by peace and prosperity, would end in division and turmoil. The very wisdom that had guided Solomon to greatness was now the very wisdom that allowed him to justify his compromises, leading to the destruction of the kingdom he had worked so hard to build. And in the end, Solomon's choice to turn away from God and embrace idolatry set into motion the unraveling of the empire and the eventual split of the kingdom after his death. Solomon had been warned. His actions, his heart that had turned away from God, had not gone unnoticed. God, in his displeasure, sent a prophet to deliver a message that would change the course of Solomon's reign. The warning was unmistakable. Solomon had broken the covenant with God, and the kingdom that had flourished under David and Solomon's leadership was now on the verge of collapse. In 1 Kings 11:9-13, we read that God's anger was stirred against Solomon because he had turned his heart away from the very God who had given him wisdom and success. And so God sent a prophet named Ahijah to deliver a powerful prophecy. The message was not just a gentle reminder, it was a clear and direct declaration that Solomon's kingdom would be torn apart. The prosperity that had characterized Solomon's reign would soon be replaced by division, strife, and turmoil. The great kingdom that Solomon had inherited and built would no longer be united under one ruler. The prophecy was not an idle threat, it was a divine warning that carried profound consequences. God spoke of taking the kingdom from Solomon's line, giving it to one of his subordinates. This was no mere political shift. It was a declaration of judgment on the choices Solomon had made. His failure to remain faithful to the covenant he had made with God had led him to a place of divine disfavor. The kingdom that had been a beacon of unity and strength was now on the brink of fracture. But instead of acknowledging the gravity of this message, instead of humbling himself before God in repentance, Solomon chose a different path. He attempted to address the situation not by returning to God, but by relying on diplomacy, wealth, and political maneuvering. Solomon, the wisest of men, thought he could somehow fix the problem through human means. He believed that he could restore peace and stability to the kingdom without first turning his heart back to the Lord. This was a turning point. Solomon had been given a clear choice: a moment where he could have humbled himself, repented, and sought God's forgiveness. But he did not. He relied on his own wisdom and diplomatic strategies, hoping that they would suffice. And in doing so, Solomon missed the opportunity to restore what had been lost. His failure to heed God's warning marked the beginning of the kingdom's decline. The consequences of his actions were now unavoidable. As the prophecy unfolded, Solomon saw the kingdom begin to unravel. The unity that had once defined Israel began to give way to division. His son, Rehoboam, would inherit the throne, but not the same united kingdom that Solomon had received. The prophecy of division came to pass. 10 tribes would break away from Solomon's descendants, leaving only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin under Rehoboam's rule. Israel would no longer be a unified kingdom, and the glory of Solomon's reign would be reduced to memories of a once great empire. This prophecy, and Solomon's refusal to repent, is one of the most tragic moments in his story. The king who had built such a magnificent kingdom, who had once been blessed with divine wisdom, had now reached the point of no return. The division of Israel marked the beginning of a long period of instability and decline for the nation. The consequences of Solomon's failure to heed the warning would echo through the generations, and the kingdom he had worked so hard to build would never fully recover. It's important to understand the weight of this moment. Solomon was not just a king who made political missteps. He was a man who had once been the recipient of divine favor, who had been entrusted with the wisdom to lead God's people. And yet he allowed his heart to drift away from the very source of his wisdom. His disobedience didn't just affect his reign, it affected the entire nation of Israel. The prophecy of division was not just a personal loss for Solomon. It was a national catastrophe, one that would affect generations to come. As Solomon faced the consequences of his actions, the message became clear. Disobedience has consequences, and even the wisest of men are not immune to the repercussions of turning away from God. Solomon's failure to heed the warning was not just about him. It was about the future of Israel, a future now marred by division, strife, and the loss of the unity that had once been the strength of the nation. As the years of Solomon's reign wore on, a stark realization began to settle in. Solomon knew that the kingdom he had built, the empire that had once stood as a symbol of prosperity and wisdom, was beginning to crumble. The wisdom that had once guided him was now clouded by the consequences of his own choices. His heart, divided and led astray by foreign influences, had caused a rift between him and God, and it seemed as though the damage was irreversible. In the final years of his reign, Solomon began to see the full weight of his mistakes. The prophecy of division had been delivered, and the kingdom's future seemed uncertain. He had been warned, but the cracks had already formed, and the once unshakable foundation of his reign was now fractured. Solomon, ever the wise ruler, knew that his kingdom could not continue down this path. The peace and prosperity that had marked the early years of his reign seemed like a distant memory, and he now sought to repair the damage that had been done. His first attempts to restore the kingdom centered on returning to God, but it was a return that came far too late. Solomon sought to rebuild the spiritual foundation of Israel by re-establishing places of worship and offering sacrifices. He began to repair the temples and altars that had been built for foreign gods during his reign. Solomon may have believed that by restoring the worship of the one true God, he could undo the damage that had been caused by his idolatrous actions. But these efforts were seen by many as too little, too late. The very temples that Solomon had once built in honor of the Lord, the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, the focal point of Israel's faith, stood as reminders of his commitment to God. But as Solomon allowed his heart to stray, the people began to lose their trust in him. The altars and high places built for foreign gods were now seen as symbols of his failure, and his attempts to reverse course were viewed with skepticism. Rebuilding temples and offering sacrifices, though noble in intention, could not erase the spiritual rift that had been created by his earlier choices. Solomon, in his desperation to mend the brokenness he had caused, turned to the rituals of repentance and atonement. He sacrificed to God, hoping to restore the favor that he had lost. But sacrifices, while a powerful symbol of devotion, could not fix the underlying issue. Solomon's heart was still divided. His repentance was not complete. It was a desperate attempt to salvage something that had already been set on a course of decline. His sacrifices, while genuine in their outward appearance, could not undo the damage done by his years of spiritual compromise. The people of Israel were not blind to Solomon's attempts at reform. They saw their king trying to regain what he had lost, but they also saw the emptiness of those efforts. The kingdom was no longer the united, powerful nation it had been under David's reign. Solomon had made too many compromises, and the seeds of division had already been sown. The cracks in the kingdom's foundation were too deep for any late-stage reforms to repair. What Solomon had failed to do in the early years of his reign, humbling himself before God and leading his people in unwavering faith, was now impossible to reverse in his final days. As Solomon tried to restore the spiritual health of his kingdom, he must have realized the futility of his efforts. The kingdom was already set on a path of division. The people who had once admired him for his wisdom were now disillusioned. The nation that had once stood as a beacon of strength and unity was now fractured, and Solomon's attempts to repair it were seen as too little, too late. The damage had been done, and the consequences of his actions were now too far-reaching to be undone by late-stage reforms. Solomon's last-ditch efforts to fix his mistakes reveal a deep sense of regret. He knew that his reign would not end with the peace and prosperity that had marked its beginning. The wisdom that had once been his greatest strength had now become a reminder of his failure. The man who had built the most glorious temple in Jerusalem, who had once been known for his unwavering devotion to God, was now struggling to undo the spiritual and political rift he had caused. His efforts to repair the kingdom were noble, but they came too late. The kingdom of Israel would soon be divided, and Solomon's reign would come to a sorrowful end. After Solomon's death, the once unified kingdom of Israel faced a future of uncertainty. Solomon's son Rehoboam ascended to the throne, inheriting a kingdom that had been built on wisdom, wealth, and divine favor. However, the peace and prosperity that had defined Solomon's reign were now distant memories. The cracks in the kingdom which had been formed during Solomon's later years were now fully exposed, and the kingdom could no longer remain whole. Rehoboam, though Solomon's son, did not possess the same wisdom or favor that his father had once enjoyed. Upon taking the throne, Rehoboam was faced with the immediate challenge of managing a divided and restless kingdom. The people, weary from heavy taxes and forced labor under Solomon's rule, came to Rehoboam asking for relief. They begged him to ease the burdens that had been placed upon them. The decision Rehoboam made in response would seal the fate of Israel. Rehoboam consulted with the older advisors who had served Solomon, who urged him to be a servant leader, to lighten the load on the people and earn their loyalty. However, he also listened to the younger men, his peers, who encouraged him to be harsh, to show the people who was in charge. Rehoboam, in his pride, chose to follow the counsel of the younger men, responding to the people with words of oppression rather than relief. He declared that he would not lighten the burden, but would make it even heavier, saying, "My father scourged you with whips, but I will scourge you with scorpions." This harsh response led to immediate rebellion. The 10 northern tribes of Israel rejected Rehoboam as their king, and instead made Jeroboam, a former servant of Solomon, their king. The kingdom of Israel was now split in two. Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem, remained under Rehoboam's rule, while the northern tribes formed their own kingdom, called Israel, with Jeroboam as their leader. The prophecy that had been spoken to Solomon, the division of the kingdom, had come to pass. The kingdom that Solomon had so carefully built, with all its wealth, wisdom, and power, was now divided, never to be the same again. The division of the kingdom was not just a political split, it was a spiritual one as well. Solomon's mistakes, particularly his failure to maintain the religious integrity of Israel, had set into motion the events that led to this fracture. His marriages to foreign women and the worship of idols had weakened the spiritual foundation of the kingdom. The heart of Israel, its devotion to God, had been compromised. Solomon's idolatry and spiritual disobedience created a rift between God and the people of Israel. When Rehoboam failed to listen to the people's plea for relief, that rift only deepened, leading to a division that was both political and spiritual. Israel was never the same again. The golden age of Solomon's reign, with its peace and prosperity, turned to dust in the wake of his mistakes. The kingdom, once united under a wise and prosperous king, was now a divided nation. The northern tribes under Jeroboam would go on to establish their own religious practices, building golden calves in Bethel and Dan, in direct rebellion to God's commandments. The southern kingdom of Judah, though it remained loyal to the Davidic line, would face its own challenges, struggling with idolatry and disobedience for generations. Solomon's failure to keep Israel united spiritually and politically left a lasting impact on the nation. The kingdom would never fully recover from the division. Over the centuries, the divided kingdoms would face invasions, internal strife, and eventual conquest. The northern kingdom of Israel would fall to the Assyrians in 722 BC, and the southern kingdom of Judah would be taken by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Solomon's reign, which had begun with such promise and success, ended in division and despair. The kingdom of Israel, once the envy of the ancient world, was now fractured beyond repair. The mistakes of one man, the spiritual compromises, the political missteps, the failure to remain faithful to God, had set in motion a chain of events that would haunt Israel for centuries. The golden age of Solomon's reign was a fleeting moment, and his kingdom was never able to fully recover from the consequences of his actions. In the final years of his life, Solomon, the man once celebrated as the wisest on earth, found himself facing a reality that few could have imagined in his youth. The glory that had marked the early years of his reign was gone, replaced by a quiet, heavy emptiness. He had achieved wealth, power, and fame beyond measure, but the kingdom he had inherited and expanded was now a shadow of its former self. The unity of Israel, once unshakable under David and his early reign, had fractured. The spiritual foundation that had guided him in his youth was weakened, and Solomon himself had wandered from the devotion that had once defined him. It is said that in those final years, Solomon was filled with a profound sense of regret. The decisions he had made, alliances forged through marriages, the toleration and worship of foreign gods, and the burdens imposed upon his people, now weighed heavily on his conscience. He had once walked in the favor of God, the recipient of divine wisdom, and yet he had allowed his heart to drift. Perhaps, as he reflected on his life, he realized that wisdom alone had not been enough. Knowledge and understanding could not protect him from the consequences of turning away from the principles that had once guided him. Solomon's wealth and splendor could not fill the void left by his spiritual compromise. He had built temples for God and altars for idols, yet the emptiness he felt in his heart could not be reconciled through material success or political strategy. The alliances that had seemed so advantageous in his youth now appeared as sources of corruption. Each foreign wife and idol representing a step further from the faith that had brought him to greatness. The very wisdom that had once drawn kings and nations to seek his counsel could not restore the unity and devotion that his kingdom had lost. In his solitude, it is likely that Solomon contemplated the cost of his choices, not just for himself, but for his people. The kingdom he had labored to build, the treasures he had accumulated, the temple he had constructed with devotion and care, none of these could undo the spiritual drift that had taken root. He may have understood, too late, that the blessings he had enjoyed were conditional upon faithfulness, humility, and obedience. His reflection must have been heavy with the knowledge that he had turned away from the very source of his wisdom, allowing pride, desire, and compromise to guide his heart. The great king who had once settled disputes with unmatched insight and whose wisdom had been revered throughout the world, was now left to reckon with the consequences of his actions. Regret, perhaps, was the only companion in those final days, as Solomon faced the reality that the glory of his reign had been overshadowed by the decline that his own choices had set into motion. His legacy, though marked by wisdom and achievement, was forever tainted by the compromises he had allowed in his personal and spiritual life. It is possible that, as he approached the end, Solomon gained a clearer understanding of the emptiness that comes from turning away from God. The man who had been capable of extraordinary judgment and insight was now confronting a truth he could not escape. Knowledge without humility, wisdom without obedience, and achievement without faith ultimately leave a person spiritually bankrupt. Perhaps in these final moments, Solomon's heart began to recognize the depth of his folly. Not in material terms, but in spiritual terms, seeing how far he had strayed from the path that could have sustained both him and his kingdom. Solomon's last days, then, are a testament to the human condition, even for the wisest among us. They show the cost of choices made for convenience, compromise, or desire, and the weight of spiritual neglect. In solitude, surrounded by the grandeur of a kingdom that had lost its unity and divine favor, Solomon faced the profound reality that wisdom alone cannot prevent the consequences of a divided heart. In the end, the man who had been celebrated for his insight and judgment had become a shadow of his former self, a ruler whose life serves as both a lesson and a warning for all who would follow in his footsteps. Solomon passed away after a long and prosperous reign, but by the time of his death, he was no longer the king he once was. His death marked the end of an era of peace, prosperity, and unity that had made Israel the envy of surrounding nations. The splendor of Solomon's reign had once radiated across the ancient world, a time when his wisdom was sought after by kings and queens, and his kingdom was rich with culture, wealth, and divine favor. But by the time Solomon closed his eyes, that golden age was gone. The Israelites, once unified under Solomon's leadership, now faced a future filled with uncertainty. His reign had begun with such promise, but the division that had been set into motion by his compromises had already begun to take its toll. Solomon's mistakes, his turn toward idolatry, his heavy taxation of the people, and his inability to heed God's warnings left a kingdom fractured, both spiritually and politically. When Solomon passed, his son Rehoboam inherited a kingdom that was already on the verge of division, not just by politics, but by the spiritual drift that had plagued Solomon's reign. The cracks in the foundation had grown too wide to be repaired. Though Solomon's name continues to live on in history, remembered for his wisdom and accomplishments, his death was the tragic conclusion to a life filled with unfulfilled potential. Solomon had been given everything: wealth beyond measure, a kingdom blessed with peace, wisdom that surpassed all who came before him. But in the end, all of it was overshadowed by the consequences of his actions. The very wisdom that had made him great became a tragic reminder of his failure to live up to the responsibility it carried. His choices, his alliances with foreign women, his disregard for God's commandments, and his refusal to fully repent left a legacy of division and spiritual decline. Solomon's life serves as a powerful warning. Wisdom and greatness are not always enough to guarantee success. For all his wisdom, Solomon was unable to guard his own heart. His reign, which began with such divine favor, was marred by his personal choices that led him to turn away from the very God who had blessed him. His legacy, while still celebrated for his intellectual and political achievements, is also a sobering reminder that true success is not measured by wealth, power, or wisdom alone. It is measured by loyalty to God, by humility, and by the integrity to live according to the values one professes. In the end, Solomon's death was not just the end of a king, it was the end of an era of unity and divine favor. His kingdom, which had once flourished under God's blessings, was now divided and weakened. The peace that Solomon had secured through diplomacy and wisdom gave way to internal strife, and the unity of Israel, once so strong, was now lost. The tragic reality is that despite all his wisdom, Solomon's greatest downfall came from his failure to remain faithful to God. His reign, once a shining example of greatness, was now a cautionary tale of the dangers of compromise, pride, and spiritual neglect. Solomon's story is a paradox. He had everything that could be desired in this world: wealth, wisdom, and power, but lost the most important thing of all: his devotion to God. His life serves as a lesson for us all, that without a heart fully committed to righteousness, even the greatest wisdom can falter. It's not enough to possess wisdom if it's not accompanied by faithfulness and humility. Solomon's life reminds us that the pursuit of wisdom, without the anchor of spiritual integrity, ultimately leads to emptiness. King Solomon's story is a complex one, filled with both grandeur and tragedy. His wisdom was unmatched, admired by all who sought his counsel, and tested by kings and queens from distant lands. He built a kingdom of unparalleled wealth and peace, and his rule was a beacon of success. Yet behind the glimmering facade of his reign, there lay a deeper truth. Solomon's heart strayed from the path of righteousness. The man who had been gifted with the wisdom to rule justly, who had been blessed with the favor of God, allowed his own desires and compromises to lead him astray. Solomon's death marked the end of an era, a time when Israel stood united under a king who had achieved greatness through wisdom and divine favor. Yet by the time Solomon passed, the unity that had been his kingdom's strength was no more. The kingdom that had once been a model of peace and prosperity was now fractured, divided by the very choices Solomon had made in his later years. The cracks in his reign, though small at first, had become too deep to repair, and they would forever alter the course of Israel's history. Solomon's life serves as a powerful reminder that even the wisest of men can fall. Wisdom alone is not enough. True wisdom does not rest in wealth, power, or the accumulation of knowledge. It lies in unwavering loyalty to the right principles, in remaining true to God and to what is just and righteous. Solomon, for all his brilliance and achievements, failed to heed the most important wisdom of all: faithfulness and humility before God. He lost sight of the very foundation that had once made him great. Solomon may have been the wisest king ever to live, but in the end, it was his wisdom that failed him. His kingdom, once united, would never fully recover from the division he unwittingly set in motion. The story of Solomon is not just a tale of triumph, but a sobering lesson about the dangers of compromise and the consequences of turning away from the very values that guide us. His life stands as a reminder that even the greatest wisdom cannot protect us from our own choices. If we stray from the path of righteousness, no amount of wisdom or success can save us.